All right, welcome to this session. First session, the plenary session, is a very hard act to follow. My goodness, what can I possibly do that will be interesting after that? Fortunately, I don't feel constrained to be interesting, so you'll hear my ordinary presentation instead. Thought I'd start with a picture taken from my badge cam and instead give you the next hour of my life as recorded with author's commentary. The title is The Law That Counts, and what I'm intending to do here is just to suggest some directions for the bibliometric analysis of law. First of all, what is bibliometrics? Well, it's the study of literatures by quantitative analysis. It is useful, again, if at all. Bibliometrics is one of the things that a lot of people look at and think, why? You know, who ever thought of this? Isn't this sort of missing the concept to count books rather than read them? Isn't there something sort of profoundly silly about this? And yet there's some people who just love it. And this is probably why I'm drawn to it. It's just entertaining. You can do things that you can't do any other ways. However, if you're looking for practical applications, it seems to me they fall into two categories. One is that there are applications of bibliometrics for librarians and information managers, for people who handle the stuff and want to look at it quantitatively. And that there are some kind of time-tested bibliometric truths that have been absorbed by librarians and other people who deal with this. But probably the most interesting thing to do, and what I'll try to get at a little bit, is that bibliometrics can help you understand the underlying activity, the activity that generates the literature in a way that might be difficult to do in other ways, or at least difficult to validate. I want to begin, though, by showing you some of the classic applications from the sciences. The book that I took these next four examples from is by Derek DeSola Price, called Little Science, Big Science. Just a classic of bibliometric analysis. He invented a lot of the stuff that people have been doing since. The book was published in 1963, so all the examples are a little dated now. But I still just love these things, because they seem to have attracted a generation of library school students to want to do this stuff. Here's one of his first important charts. Here he's plotted, and I don't know how well you can see this. Boy, that is big screen. Maybe you can even see this. It's a semi-log plot of the type much loved by bibliometricians, in which he has plotted the number of scientific journals and the number of abstract journals by date. And the first thing to notice is that the plot is, except in the early years for for both actually, reasonably linear, which suggests exponential growth of the literature. But the real insight here is that there seems to be a relationship between journals and abstract journals. That is, for every 300 scientific journals, you need an abstract journal. And by plotting it over time, you can validate this. This is how much literature you need in order to get, or in order to need that kind of control. So presumably, at 300 squared, you need abstracts of abstracts. I don't know if we've hit that level out. We certainly hadn't in 1960 when he was dealing with this. And again, this has a feeling of just a kind of insight that you don't get by actually reading the books themselves. You just feel empowered in an odd way by counting things. Here's another example showing the natural growth of the literature in certain areas. And what Price is getting at here is that there seems to be, at least on these plots, after a startup, a natural rate of growth of the sciences. At least when he was doing it, Sciences doubles their literature output in 15 years. That is, for the chemical abstracts and biological and physics abstracts, they reached their natural level at which they were supposed to be, and then they fell into the groove of science doubling every 15 years. Now again, that finding probably wouldn't hold up now. I don't know exactly what would have happened to it. But this is, again, the sort of thing that you want to do. So you can look at the bottom plot for mathematical review, and you say, well, mathematics is obviously not a mature discipline because it hasn't found its groove. It hasn't found the right slope. This is a famous plot. I apologize for the fact this doesn't have a caption, but it didn't have one in the book, and I couldn't think of an easy way to represent it. But this is a plot that's much loved by people who do citation analysis everywhere. This is a graphical representation of the the citation relationships in a small, closed scientific study. This is the study of N-rays, and there are exactly 200 scientific journal articles, all told, on the subject of N-rays, and then they stopped when someone discovered the rather embarrassing fact that N-rays don't actually exist. So it's sort of a lovely literature to study because you know there's never going to be any more of it, and it's just a wonderful treat that it turned out to be exactly 200 papers. But when you look at the plot, you can see that the diagonal part, that is, the papers are arranged in chronological order, both up and down, and the diagonal part that's set off by the dotted line represents the research front. It's the last 45 papers citing each other. And then you'll notice that there are some papers that are represented by vertical trails of dots. Those are the review papers. So that by looking at plots like this, first of all, you can get some sense of what the currency was, at least in this discipline at that time, how deep you'd have to go for the research front. And then you'd also find a periodic spacing of reviews, so you can tell how often the literature needs to stop and digest what it knows and present itself from there on. And then my last example from Price is a good Cold War diagram. This is the percentage of the total output of science by country. This is meant to scare you. You notice that scientific output in Germany has declined markedly, but the Soviet Union is growing rapidly. The British Commonwealth seems to be holding its own, and so forth. It seems to me that this kind of analysis was very, very current when I was young, which, of course, a long time ago. This is sort of a product of the Sputnik mentality, worrying about the science gap and wanting some objective way to quantify the amount of science and the fact that those godless communists may have more science than we do soon because they're growing quickly. All right, let me tell you what I plan to do with this in law. I got a couple of data sets to analyze. I didn't actually get the data set I wanted most, which was a dump of the citation database. So I had to think of things that I could do without the citations right now, although the citations are coming, and give you some idea of what my raw data is. This is data that I finally talked people out of at West, my employer. I have a dump from the central headnotes database that contains 3,734,339 fully reported cases, and you'll see the great majority of those are after 1900, which is the scope of most of what I'm doing here. Those headnotes got a little over 21 million classifications. For the most part, that means very nearly 21 million headnotes, although there are occasionally double classifications. I think the current practice is that the posting density for headnotes is about 1.18 classifications per headnote. So by and large, the key number system still represents the kind of mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive classification system that was so roundly decried by our plenary speaker yesterday morning. First, just looking at the cases. Now, what I've done here is do a sort of classic Price-esque semi-log plot of the growth of case law. But you'll notice that this plot doesn't remind you a whole lot of Price's plots of the growth of the sciences, that only for a while in the early period does it look like it's very substantially logarithmic. Otherwise, it's sort of lumpy and uninteresting. So instead, I'm going to show you the plot with an ordinary scale, because I think it's easier to see the effects here. And again, this may look like just the foothills of something. Hard to tell exactly what's going on, but I'd like to point out three effects that I think you can get at by looking at this plot. First of all, the most substantial rise, the steepest rise, and it corresponds to the part of the earlier plot which really did look like logarithmic growth, represents the space from about 1879 to 1888, which was the build-out of the key number system, or excuse me, the build-out of the national reporter system. It seems to me that this is a pretty clear example of the technology of distributing cases causing an outpouring of cases themselves. Now, there were undoubtedly other reasons in the 1880s why case law grew so quickly, but it really is a very dramatic rise, a very substantial increase. On the other hand, you'll notice that there are a couple of events that are not good for the production of cases. Those are the world wars. You see that for World War I and World War II are both marked by a really pretty substantial decline in the number of reported cases. And that apart from that, there seems to be a fairly steady increase in the number of cases until you get to about 1985. And at 1985, the body of case law, at least as represented by reported cases, stops growing and starts declining a little bit, something that few people expected a few years ago. Now, what I'm not showing you here that helps explain that to a pretty good extent is the enormous growth in the publication of unreported cases. It's the point where fully reported cases are on the order of 50,000 a year, and unreported cases are at least 80,000 and growing rapidly. And what with the wider publication of unreported cases, and as I understand it, any day now we expect a ruling that, at least for federal courts, no citation rules are going to be abrogated. I think that unreported cases are becoming a more and more interesting part of this, the total mixture of case law. In fact, I think that the whole concept of unreported case has become rather a difficult one. When you get unreported cases that have full editorial treatment and appear in paper books, in what sense are they unreported? My guess is that in a few years we're going to have a different name for these things. We may still make a distinction between one kind of case and another, but it's going to be increasingly anachronistic to call it reported versus unreported. And it may be that some interesting change in the way the law has handled itself is going to be attendant on that. The next thing I did, and this is what I've done for most of the lecture here, is I plotted, or I automatically detected topical areas that have an increasing amount of traffic in the key number system. You see, I normalized this by the total number of headnotes so that the general growth in the law wouldn't make it look like everything was going to grow. And I also used a fairly squirrely statistic, which will show some artifacts in my list, in which I ordered the topics by my confidence that they were really growing, which means that it prefers topics that are big topics that get lots of traffic just because the numbers are larger and the statistical significance is easier to prove.
These are from the top level of the 7?
Yes, top level of the 400 and some topics. And again, there's some infelicities to this. There are tiny little topics like Neaxiat, which doesn't get enough traffic to plot at all. You're never going to be able to trend Neaxiat in any reasonable way. Whereas great big topics like civil rights and appeal and error that get lots of traffic are going to show up easily. But it seems to me that as you go down this list, this does at least potentially confirm things that make sense in terms of what the law is concerned about. I don't think it's any surprise that the number one growing topic over the last 20 years is civil rights. We're simply more concerned with civil rights. The civil rights topic takes discrimination of all kinds. It takes employment discrimination, it takes sexual discrimination, it takes lots of topics that have been much in the news. The second may be sort of a surprise, appeal and error. Appeal and error, I think, appears on this list because it reflects the fact that state appellate courts are taking stronger control of their own dockets, that there is now such a flood of information coming in, particularly to the courts of last resort in the states, that the states feel the need to discuss in much more detail what the parameters of appeal are. Again, statutes make sense. The law is becoming more frequently statutory. There are a couple of things on this list. Habeas corpus, important for prisoners' rights. Federal courts takes many of the same issues that for state courts go to the topic appeal and error, again, representing a greater discussion of the control of the docket of federal courts. Arbitration, infants, an uglily named topic. That takes mostly criminal law regarding children. Constitutional law, patents, contracts. Negligence is sort of an interesting one because negligence takes a lot of the new kinds of negligence that don't have enough cases to have a whole topic of their own, so that you get some interesting things there. Torts also, for example, interference with contractual advantage. That's one of the torts that doesn't have its own topic yet, so it just goes into torts. But those things tend to grow. Consumer protection, aliens, and so forth. I guess the one that I'd like to focus on, though, for a moment, is sentencing and punishment, which I think has a sort of interesting history to it. Just remember that this is on the list at position number 15. Not a huge growth, but it made the top 15 list, even if just. We'll look at some topics that are shrinking. These are things that may not be shrinking in absolute terms, but again, are shrinking as a relative share of the total body of case law. Again, there are various things going on here, and I'll return to some of these lists later. I show you what it is if instead of just taking the last 20 years, you take it out by decade. What was growing and shrinking in the 1990s? Well, to a good extent. And on many of these next slides, I have two columns. The left-hand column are the top 10 growing ones, and the right-hand column are the top 10 shrinking ones, so that you can see what was going on an entire decade on one slide. And I guess what I wanted to note here is that while one of the growing topics from 1984 to 2003 was sentencing and punishment, sentencing and punishment is the number one declining topic for the 1990s. And you see the 1990s is right in the middle of the earlier part we were talking about. So this struck me as being a peculiarity. When I first saw it, I assumed that I'd done something wrong and I'd messed up my data somehow. Had me go look at it. But I found out that the data is actually right. You plot sentencing and punishment by itself, and it looks like this. That is, it grows for a while in the 80s, and then it declines for a while, and it grows again. So that if you regress the total sequence, you get a significant positive trend. But if you look just at the interior part of the 90s, you get a substantial negative trend. Now, again, in an effort to understand what was going on with sentencing and punishment, I pulled out the state cases. And the state cases are not doing much. The scale on the left, by the way, is the percentage of total classifications for that area. So for state cases, somewhere between 4 and 5% of all American cases seem to involve sentencing and publishing, or sentencing and punishment. Boy, that's yes. Let's not go into the psychology of that slip. However, when you look at federal cases, the trend really emerges. And the federal cases tell a very substantial story. It's hard to find something that's this dramatic in any of these plots. But it seems to me that just as we could pull out a few elements on the total number of cases being published, there are things about American politics and criminal policy, especially on the federal side, that you can see from this plot. beginning in 1984, for example, we had the Federal Sentencing Reform Act that created the federal sentencing guidelines that were first published in late 86 and went into effect in 97. Now, one of the things that the Sentencing Reform Act did is that it made sentencing separately appealable in a way that it hadn't been before. So it just makes a lot of sense that there would suddenly be lots of appeals because there would be an issue that deserved to be talked about. So at least part of this you can see as the natural trajectory that traces a change in the law. According to the Sentencing Reform Act, there's going to be a large number of cases coming into the legal literature, and then after a while you might expect the problems to be solved. That a lot of these issues would have been heard, there would be fewer cases of first impression, and there would be a natural subsidence in the number of sentencing and punishment cases as there's less uncertainty in the area. But when I saw this plot, I talked to some of my friends who are close to the federal courts and know something about this, talked to some of the people who classify the topic sentencing and punishment. They said that something else was going on here also. That essentially there was an enormous rise up until 1990, and then it subsided for two reasons. And one of them I've already mentioned. It subsided because some of the problems were solved and there were just fewer new thoughts to think in the area of sentencing and punishment. But it also subsided because there was a general perception that was shared by judges and prosecutors and defense counsel that the guideline sentences were rather severe. And during the 1990s, you can also read this by presidential election. During the presidency of Bill Clinton, there was a decline in sentencing cases because there was this agreement that downward departures from the sentencing guidelines would be common. And so there was less to talk about because everybody knew what people were doing with sentencing. But you'll notice that beginning in 2001, there's an enormous uptick in sentencing cases. And it seems to me that this represents a very conscious policy effect. This is the decision of John Ashcroft, the new Attorney General, that he was going to appeal all downward departures from federal sentences, or at least require his attorneys in the individual districts to justify any downward departure that they did not appeal. So suddenly there are a lot more appeals coming up, and you can interpret this bump at the end, taking sentence and publishing to new heights in 2002, as a political effect. This is the Ashcroft bump. I thought that it might be informative to take this analysis to a finer level of detail, and instead of looking just at the total number of sentencing publishing cases, I'd take it apart by some of the Roman numerals, some of the larger subdivisions within the topic sentence and punishment, so that I could see what was growing and when. And sure enough, you see that top black line, which is the line for sentencing guidelines, the one that's plotted with X's, that requires for an enormous proportion of the total rise. Many other things are level or declining. I think that the blue line here, which plots death penalty section, that's rather interesting because in some ways it's counter-cyclical. In the beginning, it's growing with other things. But unlike almost all of the other topics, it's actually growing while the others are declining. Through the 90s, through the Clinton years, the proportion tends to grow. And then it doesn't have an Ashcroft bump. I don't know why this is, but it countercyclically declines while everything else is going up. Again, I don't know why this is true. I've already gone probably beyond my legitimate understanding of the phenomenon here. But I guess what I want to suggest is that the bibliometrics will give you an opportunity to identify things that are worth investigating. Somebody who knew a lot about death penalty jurisprudence could probably explain this. This person is not me, but someone could. And one of the things that you could do is you could either troll through this kind of data set looking for anomalies like this, looking for interesting things to explain, or you could use it as some kind of objective confirmation of things that you can otherwise describe in qualitative terms. I mean, I think I haven't talked to anyone who practices federal criminal law that doesn't believe that policies are different under Ashcroft, that hasn't had an effect. But here you've got a graphical bump. You can actually see it happening in a way that otherwise you might not be able to. Now, I'd like to take you through the 20th century, looking at the distribution and sort of call out some of these effects that you can see and maybe identify one or two others that are a little bit odd, things that I can't explain. Starting in the 1900s, my data set goes back a little further than that, but I personally don't recommend or don't recall anything much before 1900 very clearly. What was happening in 1900? But here I find the most interesting things on the right side, the things that are declining in the way of execution and homestead and debtor and creditor, fraudulent conveyances, maybe mortgages. This looks like the pattern of a country that's coming out of the financial panics of the 1890s. This is sort of an economic recovery profile. Now, you might be able to see that more directly if you looked at the 1890s themselves. I don't have that data in this set. It seems to me that that tells you a story about what's going on. On the positive side, I was caught by the topic intoxicating liquors. Now, this is before Prohibition. Prohibition was passed in 1919. But perhaps what we're seeing here is the beginnings of the movement that culminates in the passing of Prohibition. Again, many things that I can't explain here. I don't know, for example, why the topic trial grew in the 1900s. I just, not a clue. But if you are a student of the history of procedure in state courts, perhaps you would want to know this. Perhaps this would alert you to the fact that there is a phenomenon, there is something to look for that could be explained by the topic trial. Let's go into the 1910s. Well, the big grower here is workers' compensation. Workers' compensation was invented in the decade of the 19-teens. I didn't know this, but it took me only a few minutes after I saw it on this chart to confirm the fact that the 19-teens are when workers' compensation began to happen in the United States. Obviously, automobiles makes sense that technological innovation would show up in this list. Going on to the 1920s, well, the big rise here is internal revenue. Again, the federal income tax was passed in the early teens, but it really came into its own in the 20s. Automobiles are still growing. And then by the 20s, you see on the other side, on the shrinking side, all of the topics that seem to be cut into by the rise of automobiles. You see carriers and railroads and urban railroads declining. That we're sensing shifting technological patterns, again, in the distribution of headnotes. Now, again, there are things that I can't particularly explain. I don't know, for example, why banks and banking grew in the 20s, although I guess it makes sense. The banks were growing, they were boom years. But a financial historian might look at that and say, yes, of course, that's true. Or it's possible they say, no, it's not true. But on the other hand, it's got to be here for some reason. That's the delicious thing about this kind of technique is that it gives you actual data that must come from somewhere. Now, of course, at its worst, it could come because the data is bad. It could be that some strange practice at West Publishing was causing these effects to look like they were happening. But one of the nice things about this data set is that you have to worry about this a lot less than some others because of the West practice of always going back and reclassifying to the beginning of time every time they change things. So, for example, I showed you the time scale for the topic sentencing and punishment. That's a topic that didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. It was recently created, but because it was retrospectively applied to everything, we can look back in time as if it had always been there, because the cases were always there and they were somewhere. So you could pull them out and see where they were going. On to the 1930s. Well, what's happening? Constitutional law. The great new federal expansion is going on. So you find a substantial growth there. You find topics like statutes and labor and employment. Again, this is the FDR stuff kicking in. Again, I'm not sure I could tell you why criminal law is declining. Well, criminal law, by the way, is a procedural topic. But yeah, for further investigation, let's look at the 40s. Again, now criminal law is growing. Criminal law is such a big topic that I detect even small fluctuations in it, so it bounces around a good deal. Again, in the 40s, administrative law and procedure is coming up. Vendor and purchaser, the topic United States. The government is growing. All right, go to the 1950s. What's growing? Well, here it seems to me there's a pretty clear effect of the rapid economic development of the country. You have eminent domain, zoning and planning near the top of the list. The system is growing, and it's growing in sort of a controlled and governmental way. On the other hand, you have a peace effect. Now that the Second World War is over, the topic war and national emergency, which takes largely things like price controls on steel and so forth, that's declining very rapidly because it's no longer necessary to have those effects. But again, I'm struck by the fact that in the 1950s, the single most rapidly declining topic is wills. What's going on here? Are we seeing the rise of other forms of estate planning? I mean, maybe that's it. Maybe just not enough people are dying in the 50s. I don't know. But with a data set like this, you could go look for those things and perhaps find. What's happening in the 60s? Well, here we have criminal law and constitutional law, arrests, searches, and seizures. It's clear what's happening here. And now I understand the criminal law one. This is the great expansion of procedural rights for criminal defendants according to the decisions of the Warren Court, so that you have things like arrests and searches and seizures and habeas corpus and sentencing and punishment. All of that is growing very rapidly to the top. Another thing that I think is interesting in the 1960s is you see the topic armed services come up. Those are draft cases for the most part. Those are cases that are caused by the beginnings of the Vietnam War. Okay, moving on to the 1970s, what's growing? Well, on the negative side, early in the decade, the draft is discontinued, so armed services declines rapidly. Armed services, with particularly the draft cases, had its moment in the 1960s. What's growing now? On the military side, the war is still being fought, and military justice, the topic that takes criminal cases concerning members of the armed forces, it's growing rapidly. Apparently, there are more crimes being committed or allegedly committed by soldiers, and we're seeing that just because the armed forces are growing so rapidly. But civil rights, again, is at the top of the list. The civil rights movement is kicking in. The 1980s, and this takes us almost up to the point we've seen, as I've already showed you what was happening for sentencing and punishment. In the 1980s, it was the most substantially growing thing. Bankruptcy is second. Maybe you can see economic downturns through bankruptcy. Again, you've got administrative law reform. You see the influence of the remaking of the federal government, especially through the prominence of a topic like administrative law and procedure on the positive side. On the other hand, you see the topic monopolies declining. Perhaps you're getting less antitrust enforcement in Reagan administration or Reagan-Bush administration. I'm sorry?
Yeah, you wake up with the Bells and the IBM case right around 81, 82. But
Yeah.
that's not enough for the whole nation.
Well, but effects like that, and you've got to be very careful in interpreting this data, because if you did have a big something that happened very early in the decade, then that would tend to give you a downward trend that would show up on this. Again, almost any of these things you would want to look at in more detail before coming to fast conclusions on them. I guess I just offered this as a way of trolling through the data, looking for possible effects that that are worth looking at in more detail. I'm going to conclude, again, by giving you some summaries of what's growing and what's shrinking. And this time I'll break it apart into state and federal. What's happening, and I didn't put the date range here. This is the same date as I used before, the 20-year time period from 1984 to 2003. So what's really happening with states? Again, appeal and error is at the top of the list, partly because it's an enormous topic and it's easy to detect trends in it, but also because I think this does represent a substantial effort on the part of state courts to try and get a stronger control of their docket. Again, statutes, arbitration, attorney and client, negligence, lots of these things I think are not particularly surprising as you go down the list. You'll see that civil rights, while on the list, is in the 20th position. It's a fairly small effect for state cases. What's shrinking in state cases, and this I find a lot more difficult to explain, witnesses. Witnesses. Why is the topic witnesses shrinking more quickly than anything else in state cases? Again, I am without clue on this. Maybe somebody else in the room has a theory about it, but I have no idea why this effect should be seen. Perhaps worth looking into. What's growing for federal cases? Well, civil rights, again, over the 20 years, the strongest effect. Habeas corpus, sentencing and punishment. You find convicts, some of the lists, weapons, arrest. You find the remaking of the criminal law showing up. And then some other things that come up. Patents has been very strong recently. Aliens, immigration control is coming up, consumer protection. Okay, this is essentially what I have for you. What I wanted to do was show you some data, talk my way through some of it. My guess is that there will be at least some people who would be interested in getting these lists if you want to pursue them yourself. So send me an email and I'll go ahead and send you a copy of this presentation. Oh, I didn't show the shrinking topics for federal cases. There are relatively few of these that I understand either. Again, the United States takes a lot of cases about federal employment. So maybe the relative de-emphasis of the rights of federal employees is shrinking. But it also takes cases of various other kinds, I'm not sure. Military justice is shrinking. Monopolies is shrinking. Well, that seems to me to be a trend in antitrust enforcement. Merit systems protection, labor and employment, and so forth. Okay, that's what I have. Close with another picture I took last night. Yes? Yes, the question is that some of these topics, to paraphrase, some of these topics are so big they cover lots of different kinds of things, and wouldn't it be nice to look at it more analytically? I already suggested that I did that once for sentencing and punishment, taking it at least to the first subdivision level, but particularly, as you say, for a topic like health and environment, actually the topic is now health. We abolished the topic health and environment a couple of years ago. But health includes lots of stuff. It has the public health stuff, but it also has medical malpractice. And you might find very different trends for those areas. The short answer is no, I haven't done any of that analysis. But if anybody's interested in pursuing something in particular, I may not be allowed to give you the data set. Because when you think about it, the data set is the crown jewels of West. It is our last 100 years of headnote assignments and so forth, and we wouldn't want that going into the wrong hands. But why? Some odd misspeakings today. So, but I could probably run statistical summaries of it, and I'd be glad to send you the numbers. At a certain level of analysis, though, the absolute numbers are so small that it's very hard to generalize from them. So with very rare exceptions, I don't think you could do much with individual key numbers, just because if an individual key number had enough cases so that it made substantial plottable trends that you could do time series on, we'd want to subdivide it. There are very few key numbers that we find that we can't subdivide. Well, let me just, as a matter of curiosity, tell you what the single most populous key number in the key number system is. That's the one on ethical violations by attorneys. And we would love to subdivide it, but we find it very hard to do because whenever a lawyer comes up on ethical charges, they never do just one thing. In almost all cases, this person stole clients' money and didn't return phone calls and didn't prosecute the case and had a substance abuse problem and so forth. And so it would make sense for us to have separate lines for various kinds of malfeasance with client funds and communication problems and fee abuses and so forth. But you can almost never take them apart in individual cases because all the attorneys who actually get hit with these things have done them all. And so we would just be replicating the problem. The system would become bigger because we'd have to multiply post all of the things that occur. So that's a particular key number that probably does have enough individual postings to plot. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'll probably go home and do that. But it's resisted subdivision for that reason. Yes, Yolanda? Yes. We now have a new topic, environment, that was created partly from health and environment, when we broke up health and environment. And it has the environmental part of health and environment. It also has some other things in it. For example, we finally got the Endangered Species Act cases out of the topics fish and game. We feel very good about that. We feel that this is a much more current view of the law, just as we were particularly pleased when we managed to finally, earlier this month, retire the topic master and servant. Master and servant is no more. It's now labor and employment. But yes, again, you could take a topic like environmental law and you could plot it, but you could also plot it separately for water and air and the other major subdivisions there, and you might see some interesting trends. Yes?
Case law is fabulous and fascinating. Statutory law is very important. I think it would be interesting if you could consider making plots and juxtaposing major statutory events. You alluded to that with looking at the passage of the Sentencing Reform.
Yes.
But I saw it when you noted that bankruptcy was growing in the 80s, and I think, geez, wasn't there a new bankruptcy code in 78 or 80?
Yes.
Picking out the major changes, Civil Rights Act of 1964, then, is that the watershed, or does it take 3 years for the cases to work through? A fun game to play while you have your statistical data set.
Yeah, absolutely. Interpreting these things responsibly at all, and most of the interpretations I've offered so far have only the smallest gesture in the direction of being responsible, because I haven't done a lot of this research for those things, but would require you to figure out where the effects are coming from, and statutes would be one of the chief sources of those. I suppose that you could also, though, and this is a data set I don't have, and it may be that the numbers are too small to do anything interesting with it, but take the library references on statutes themselves and identify areas of statutory activity, which would be really interesting. Is it a question for you?
Yes. Have you or has Wes done anything to analyze beyond the key number system with unpublished decisions?
There are things that you can do with unpublished decisions. In a few years, they will be easier to do because a fairly large proportion of unpublished decisions are now getting key number classifications. And so you could do it just the same way. And in an earlier version of this, when I didn't take out the key number classifications that the unpublished are getting, certain topics like prisons and habeas corpus and things that relate to the enormous mass of prisoner appeals that are reflected in the unpublished decisions of most courts. Those things just took over. You couldn't see any other effects for the fact that those cases were coming in. Right now, the build-out of tracking the unpublished decisions is proceeding at what we think is a fairly rapid clip, but it's not there now. And one of the reasons I discontinued some of my analysis in 2000 is I didn't want it confused by some of the effects that you see from those things happening. Now, what could you do for a body of literature that didn't have intellectual indexing applied to it? Well, probably the most popular technique is an approach that's called various things, but generally related by something like latent semantic indexing. You take a large group of cases, you cluster them according to words and phrases they contain, and then you could probably time series those clusters. I'd be a little less confident of the integrity of that data just because odd things happen in latent semantic indexing. You get strange combinations of topics, and since you didn't really put them there, it can be very hard to track them. But on the other hand, if you wanted to analyze a large body of things like unreported decisions for which you had no manual classifications, LSI is probably just the ticket. I have no special inclination to do that just because I've got more work than I could do for the foreseeable future and working with cases for which I think I've got better data. Marianne?
Your cases are dependent on the number of cases in the base case. I mean, like if you have 100 cases and something, you get 50, that's a 50% increase. But if you get 1,000 and you get 50, that's how do you control that?
Well, and you're identifying the squirreliest thing I did in my statistics, which if I write this up for publication, I may have to rethink this strongly. I was just trying to find an easy way to sort these things up. So here's what I did. I took the topic over the relevant time period, and I did a linear regression, so I trended it. And then on each end, I applied my confidence level, and I took that out of it. So what I'm getting as my final metric is the absolute size of the rise in frequency less the uncertainty. That's why the big topics get pushed around so much. Why even a small but real increase in a huge topic like appeal and error or criminal law comes right to the top, whereas it would take a big effect in a smaller topic. Now, at some point, I've got to reconsider that and not do it. On the other hand, you've got to have some principled way to just ignore the little topics. As I say, if you don't try to control for significance, you probably see wild patterns in Nexiat, which are just profoundly uninteresting. Nexiat, N-E-E-X-E-A-T. I have no idea what it means. It's somebody, presumably at West, whoever classifies the topic Nexiat, at least knows what it's supposed to be. But the fact of the matter is, it's one of our shorthand ways around the classification department for referring to the old common law writ-type topics that never happen and no one understands anymore. Although there are still some jurisdictions in which one can get a writ of Nexiat to do something. There continues to be some traffic in those areas. In fact, there are almost no topics that get no traffic at all. The topic slaves, for example, I thought would have petered out at least in the early 20th century, but it didn't. They're a continuing drumbeat, not a terribly large one, but every year there are a few new 13th Amendment claims that something constitutes slavery that go to the topic slaves. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that the raw data crown tools are less complicated. How do you make the available knowledge?
Yeah, as I say, I realize that I'm kind of opening a can of worms here. But if you want to do some of this, send me an e-note and tell me what you'd like to do. And if I can do it without giving you the entire data set, and if I don't get so many of them that I just don't have time to do it. It takes, I have to write little awk scripts to extract these data sets from myself. They're gargantuan things. And I haven't actually tested this, but I've just assumed that Access would choke on this so that I have to direct it. Now, let me see what I can do. And I will try to meet people's data needs just as much as I possibly can. And as I say, I expect even more interesting data sets to come forward. I think that the best data set for this kind of work is going to be the citation data, because then you can do the cool things of seeing not just what was published, but what was perceived to be important, what ideas got traffic. Yes?
Because it's actually used Westlaw searching for key metrics and have to run a search for each decade and a search for each topic. Just 4,000 some searches.
Yeah, I suppose there might be some of this that you could do from the public view of Westlaw, and I have no problem with people wanting to try that. But and earlier in my career, when I was still on the academic side of things before I went to West, I spent a lot of time trying to trick both Westlaw and Lexis into giving up interesting data. But I don't do that anymore for obvious reasons. But if any of you send me data requests that I think are simple to do through the public view of Westlaw, I may just tell you that. Depends on what you want to try. All right. Any more questions? Well, thank you all for coming.